The first time my mother looked at me with narrowed eyes across the dinner table, and said with icy calm, "You are not even half the woman your sister is." The words felt like a blade sliding deep into my chest. For years I had heard little remarks, subtle comparisons, sighs that carried more disappointment than pride. But this time, instead of lowering my head and swallowing the pain like I always did, I felt something inside me stiffen. My chair scraped against the polished wooden floor as I pushed it back slowly. I could hear the faint creak echo in the tense silence of the room. Then, in a voice steady enough to surprise even myself, I answered, "Then let her pay the rent for you." The air seemed to freeze. My father, who had been sipping his wine moments before, nearly dropped his glass. His voice cracked when he asked, "Rent? What rent?" In that instant, the secret I had carried like a burden for 3 endless years tumbled out without mercy. For 3 long years, I had sent money every single month, quietly, dutifully, to help them cover the mortgage on the very house we were sitting in. While my sister Claire received praise for her new promotions, her new car, and her gleaming house, I had drained my savings in silence to protect the roof over my parents' heads. If you were in my shoes, could you endure that kind of comparison? Could you live with the knowledge that every contribution you made vanished into shadows, unseen and unacknowledged? I want to ask you, as you listen, where are you right now? Are you in your car with the hum of traffic outside, or sitting in your living room, or maybe lying in bed with headphones on? I ask because I want you to imagine yourself sitting in that chair with me, staring across the table at people who never saw you for who you really were. My name is Lillian, though everyone close to me calls me Lily. I am 28 years old and live in Portland, Oregon. On paper, my life looks respectable enough. I rent a neat 1-bedroom apartment downtown. I work as a financial manager for a logistics company by the harbor, and I keep a small circle of friends who meet me for quiet dinners or hiking trips. Yet every Friday evening when I drive out to my parents' 2-story house in the suburbs, my carefully constructed calm begins to unravel. Friday dinners in our family are not simply a tradition, they are an unspoken commandment. No one is permitted to skip them. If I ever dare suggest that I need to work late, or that I just want to rest at home, my mother will call me over and over until I answer, or my father will deliver his half-serious decree, "This family has a seat for you, do not leave it empty." So week after week, without fail, I find myself at the same long table, eating my mother's cooking while sitting beneath the weight of impossible expectations. Claire, my older sister by 3 years, has always been the golden child. She is tall, articulate, a natural leader. She once captained her high school debate team and later won a scholarship to study law at a top university. Every achievement she reached was greeted with applause from our relatives and pride that spilled from my parents' mouths. She was destined to shine, they always said. And in contrast, there was me, the quieter sister, the one who loved numbers more than applause. I never complained out loud, but inside me, the comparisons etched scars. That night at dinner, the conversation, as usual, revolved around Claire. My father spoke with booming pride about her law firm victories. My mother added details about her elegant new home and the interior designs she was planning. I sat silently, moving food around my plate, my lips tight. Since I was 17, I had juggled part-time jobs to pay for my own tuition, graduated without debt, and built a steady career. I had even quietly stepped in during my parents' worst financial struggles, but no one at that table ever thought to mention any of it. In their eyes, my contributions were simply invisible, like the air they breathed. When my mother placed her fork down and delivered her familiar line, "You are not even half the woman Claire is," something inside me finally cracked. I looked at Claire's triumphant smile, and then at my parents' proud expressions, and the words slipped from my lips like ice. "Then let her pay the rent for you." The silence that followed was unbearable. I could see the color drain from my father's face as he demanded to know what I meant. My voice did not falter as I explained that for 3 years, month after month, I had been transferring money to cover their mortgage. As I spoke, my memory pulled me back to that winter evening 3 years earlier. I had been sitting in my small apartment surrounded by client files when my phone rang. It was my mother, her voice trembling with fear. "Lily," she said, "we might lose the house. Your father lost a contract and we cannot pay the bank this month. If the payment is missed, they will send a notice. I remember the chill that gripped me then, the helpless sobs on the other end of the line, and the way my chest tightened when she begged me to help just this once. I did not hesitate long. At that time, I had saved a modest sum, hoping to buy a place of my own within a few years. That dream crumbled in an instant when I heard her voice breaking. I told her I would send the money the next morning. And I did. What I did not know then was that once would turn into dozens of times. Just this once became a haunting refrain. Before I knew it, I had set up automatic transfers. For more than 3 years, I kept that house alive while sacrificing my own future. $72,000 in total. Enough to change my life. Enough to have given me the down payment for my own apartment. Enough to have freed me from renting. Yet, at that dinner table, my parents' faces hardened. My mother denied ever asking. My father claimed it was inappropriate to mention. They twisted the truth, minimized my sacrifice, and in that moment, I felt like a shadow again. My laugh that evening was not born of joy but of a bitter clarity. Inappropriate, my father had said, as if my silence for 3 relentless years had been nothing more than good manners. I looked around that familiar dining room, the chandelier casting light on faces that refused to acknowledge me, and I felt the years of swallowed hurt gather like a storm in my chest. For as long as I could remember, Claire had been their sun, dazzling and warm, while I had been expected to linger quietly in her shadow. When I was a child, family gatherings always placed Claire center stage. She would stand tall in the living room, reciting poems, telling jokes, or showing off new ribbons and certificates. Applause would fill the air, echoing through the walls. Meanwhile, I sat at the children's table, sketching numbers on a notepad or building intricate structures out of toy blocks. The only comments I ever received were whispered labels. Lily is quiet, Lily is sensitive. Words that stuck to me like glue, shaping the way my family saw me and, eventually, the way I began to see myself. Even as a teenager, my achievements never seemed to hold weight. I brought home top marks in mathematics, worked tirelessly to balance school and part-time jobs, and managed to cover my own tuition without asking for a penny. Yet when my parents spoke proudly to relatives, their stories always began and ended with Claire. She just won another debate award. She made captain. She received a scholarship. I remember clutching my exam papers, decorated with bright red letters of achievement, and realizing they were nothing more than invisible ink in this household. That evening, when I confronted them at the table, those memories rose like ghosts. My voice trembled not from fear but from the weight of years pressing out of my chest. I whispered into the silence. "Why am I always just a shadow?" No one answered. My mother set down her spoon, her gaze soft but still edged with reproach, and told me I was too sensitive. She insisted they never thought of me as less, only that Claire's path was more visible. More visible. The words struck me harder than any slap could. I wanted to shout that my sacrifices had never been invisible, that the roof over their heads had been held up by my hands. But instead of screaming, I sat in stillness, my fists tightening under the table. I realized then that it was not about the money, it was about acknowledgement, about the years of being erased, even while I carried them. When dinner ended in brittle silence, I left without another word. Driving back to my small apartment, the night outside seemed endless, the streetlights blurring into streaks of color I barely noticed. My parents' words looped in my head like a cruel refrain. Too sensitive, inappropriate, not half of your sister. By the time I unlocked my door and stepped inside, my body was trembling from exhaustion I could no longer hide. I dropped my bag by the door and collapsed at my little dining table. With hands that shook, I opened my laptop, logged into my bank account, and pulled up the scheduled transfers. Each month, on the 15th, money had left my account without fail. For 36 consecutive months, I had kept the system running like a machine. I stared at the blinking cursor, hesitated, and then pressed cancel. The confirmation box appeared. "Are you sure you want to stop?" I drew in a deep breath, pressed yes, and felt as if a cord binding me for years had finally been cut. At first, it was not relief that swept over me but an aching emptiness. For so long, my identity had been tied to those payments. Lily, the daughter who sacrificed. Lily, the one who kept the house alive. Who was I without that role? My eyes stung as I reached into the drawer and pulled out the folder I had been keeping. Inside were the printed bank statements, month after month, stacked neatly in order. I spread them across the table, the numbers glaring back at me in bold black ink. 500 here, 1,000 there, some months as much as 2,000. When I finished adding them up, the total leapt off the page: $72,000. My chest tightened. That money had been my future. The down payment for an apartment of my own, the chance to stop living in rentals that never truly felt like home. It could have been a step toward freedom. Instead, it had dissolved into a sacrifice my family refused to acknowledge. Yet, as I sat in that silence, staring at the stark truth of my own handwriting, another feeling crept in. Relief. For the first time in years, there would be no deduction from my salary, no text notification warning me of a dwindling balance. The loop of sacrifice had been broken. The thought of reclaiming my future filled me with a fragile but undeniable sense of freedom. That night, I whispered into the stillness, that money should have been the beginning of my own home. For the first time, I believed those words. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint stirrings of possibility. The next morning, sunlight streamed through my window, painting soft stripes across the floor. For once, I didn't rush to the office with a heavy heart. Instead, I pulled on my running shoes and stepped outside. The air by the Willamette River was crisp, the mist still clinging low over the water. As my feet hit the path, each stride felt like shedding an invisible weight. For the first time in years, I was running for myself, not to keep up with Claire, not to fulfill my parents' unspoken demands. My breath came harder as I picked up speed, but my chest felt strangely lighter. Change did not happen all at once, but with small choices. On Thursdays, I signed up for a cooking class at the community center. The kitchen bustled with energy, young parents laughing at their first attempts at pasta, older men carefully stirring soups, students far from home making dishes that reminded them of family. No one there knew me as the overshadowed sister. They only knew me as Lily, a woman clumsy with desserts but proud when her soup drew compliments. For the first time, I felt seen not for what I failed to be, but for what I simply was. Weekends also became a space for new beginnings. A group of friends invited me hiking near Mount Hood. Standing on the summit, gazing out at the endless spread of pine forests, I drew a long breath and felt as though my lungs had been given back to me. I wasn't the Lily chained to monthly transfers anymore. I was Lily standing tall, free to dream. Evenings in my apartment took on a new rhythm. Instead of opening my laptop to check spreadsheets or calculate how much I could spare for my parents, I brewed tea and opened a novel. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful, like a blanket I chose for myself. As my personal life shifted, so did my work. Without the constant weight of financial sacrifice pressing down on me, I had more energy to give. I took on tougher projects, pushed through long nights, and polished financial analyses until they gleamed with clarity. One evening, while I was bent over spreadsheets long after everyone else had left, the company director walked past. He paused, placed a hand on my shoulder, and said softly, "I like your dedication, Lily. This company needs more people like you." Those words, brief as they were, meant more than years of comparisons at home. They were acknowledgement, pure and simple. A month later, I was promoted to team lead for a new project. Standing at the front of the conference room, presenting my financial plan to the board, my voice shook at first, but as colleagues leaned forward and nodded, confidence swelled inside me. When the presentation ended, the applause that filled the room felt genuine. For the first time, I realized I was no longer a shadow. Not long after, an email arrived that changed everything. A fast-growing financial technology startup in Seattle had noticed my work. They wanted me as their director of financial analysis. The salary was more than 40% higher than my current pay, with stock options and opportunities I had never dreamed possible. I printed the email and set it on my kitchen table, staring at it as though it might vanish if I blinked. Moving to Seattle would mean leaving Portland, the city that had shaped my adult years, but it would also mean stepping fully out of the net my family had cast around me. I remembered that night when my mother told me I was not half the woman Claire was, and the way my father avoided my eyes when I spoke about the money. A quiet but resolute voice rose inside me. "It's time." I called my closest friend to share the news. she screamed with excitement. "Lily, you have to take it. This is your chance, your clean slate, your new beginning." Her words poured into me like warmth on a cold night. Without hesitation, I opened my laptop and replied to the email with 4 words. "I accept the offer." Those words felt like wings unfolding. For years I had been trapped in silence, weighed down by sacrifices no one acknowledged. Now, I was breaking free. I didn't know exactly what the future would hold, but for the first time, I wanted to find out, not for them, not for Claire, but for myself. In the weeks leading up to my move, I walked through Portland with new eyes. I stopped at the little cafe under the Burnside Bridge, sipping coffee while watching strangers hurry past. I wandered along streets where I had once trudged home heavy with unspoken burdens, but this time my steps felt lighter. The city had witnessed my years of sacrifice, but now it would also witness my release. Packing my apartment was strangely liberating. Each item I folded into boxes seemed to peel away a layer of chains I had carried too long. The faded blanket I once wrapped around myself during nights of stress, the mugs I drank from while staring at my dwindling savings, these things no longer held power over me. On my final day in Portland, I went for one last run along the Willamette River. My legs burned, my breath came sharp, but there was no weight pressing on me, only exhilaration. I knew challenges would come in Seattle, but at least they would be mine, chosen by me, not demanded by anyone else. 6 months later, my life was unrecognizable. The startup world in Seattle was fast, demanding, and merciless, yet I thrived. Surrounded by brilliant minds, I was measured not by my past or my family name, but by the value I brought. That environment, harsh but fair, gave me what I had longed for: recognition. My salary climbed, my stock shares gained value, and my savings grew steadily month after month. One evening, sitting alone on the balcony of my rented apartment with the city lights flickering below, I opened my personal spreadsheet. I added up the numbers, my hands trembling, and realized I finally had enough for a down payment on my first home. The thought made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with fear. I met with a real estate agent that weekend. We toured apartment after apartment, each one offering something but not enough. Some were spacious yet dim, others bright but too far from the city's pulse. I refused to rush. I had waited too long and sacrificed too much to accept anything less than the place that felt undeniably mine. And then, we stepped into a unit on the 16th floor of a newly built tower. The moment I saw the sweeping windows stretching from floor to ceiling, my breath caught. Beyond the glass, the Seattle skyline stretched wide, with the Space Needle rising tall and proud. The apartment wasn't huge, just one bedroom with polished wood floors and a compact kitchen, but sunlight poured into every corner. I walked onto the balcony, the breeze brushing my face, and in that instant, I knew. This was home. The purchase process took weeks, but every signature I scribbled felt like writing a new chapter of my life. When I finally held the keys in my hand, the cool metal sent a shiver down my spine. On that first day, I walked into the empty apartment and stood in the center of the living room. No furniture, no noise, only wide-open space, and a view that seemed to whisper, "Everything here is yours." I dropped my bag on the floor and breathed deeply, letting the silence wrap around me. For the first time, I wasn't a tenant living in someone else's space, and I wasn't the daughter sacrificing for someone else's house. This place was mine, built entirely from my effort. In the days that followed, I filled the apartment piece by piece. A light gray sofa, a small oak dining table, a bookshelf that reached nearly to the ceiling. I hung a painting of Portland's bridges on one wall, not to mourn the city I left, but to honor the journey that brought me here. Each item I chose wasn't about status or approval, it was about reflection. My apartment became a mirror of myself. One evening, I stood on the balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the Space Needle an orange glow. I snapped a photo and posted it online with only 2 words: a beginning. Minutes later, my phone buzzed. Claire had sent a message: "You're really something, why didn't you tell the family?" I stared at her words, a rush of old emotions rising: resentment, longing, the echo of years when her name was celebrated and mine forgotten. But instead of typing a reply, I placed the phone face down. I realized I no longer needed to explain, justify, or seek approval. My new home was the only proof I needed. That night, I curled up on my sofa with music playing softly in the background. The space was still bare, but for the first time in years, I felt whole. I was no longer the Lily who sacrificed in silence, no longer the shadow standing behind her sister. I was Lily, the woman who cut the ties, claimed her own life, and now sat in her own home with the city lights gleaming outside. One weekend afternoon, while I was rearranging books on my new tall shelf, my phone rang. The caller ID surprised me. It was Mrs. Jensen, the elderly neighbor from across the street back in Portland. I hadn't spoken to her in months, maybe longer. I answered with a polite smile in my voice, expecting a quick hello. Instead, her tone carried both warmth and unease. "Lily dear, how are you? I thought you should know what I just saw outside your parents' house." Before I could respond, she continued. "There's a huge banner hanging above the porch. I'll send you a picture." Seconds later, my phone buzzed with a photo. My heart dropped when I opened it. The banner stretched wide, bold red letters declaring, "Congratulations, Claire, for preserving the family home." I stared at the words until they blurred. For a moment, the apartment around me faded, replaced by memories of those late nights, the trembling calls from my mother, the endless transfers I had made. $72,000 of my life had gone into keeping that house afloat, yet the story now painted Claire as the savior. I sank onto the sofa, phone shaking in my hand. It wasn't just erasure, it was betrayal. They hadn't simply ignored my sacrifices. They had erased them, rewritten them, and handed the glory to Claire as if I had never existed. Heat surged in my chest, a burning so fierce it left me trembling. But the tears that fell this time were different. Not helpless, not silent, they carried resolve. I would not let the truth vanish. I would not let them craft a false history where my sacrifices dissolved into nothing. I had evidence. Every transfer, every text, every message begging for just this once. That night, I pulled out the folder of statements I had guarded for years. Page after page of bank slips, annotated with dates and amounts. I opened my laptop, created a spreadsheet, and entered each one. When I finished, I generated a bar chart. The rising columns told the story as clearly as any words could. Without me, that house would have been gone. I even printed my mother's desperate messages. "Lily, please, just this once. If we don't pay, the bank will take it." One message, repeated 36 times in different disguises. I stared at the report, my chest heaving. For years I had been quiet, patient, understanding. But now, I was no longer afraid of the storm the truth might unleash. If the truth embarrassed them, that was not my fault. A week later, my cousin Sarah called. She was one of the few relatives who still kept in touch. Her voice was low, hesitant. "Lily, your parents are planning a big party here in Seattle. They call it a family appreciation dinner. I was asked to put together the slideshow. You probably already know what it's about." I closed my eyes, already sensing the answer. Sarah sighed. "They want to highlight Claire's role in saving the house." Her words stabbed, but I thanked her for telling me. Later that evening, she messaged again. "I've finished the slideshow. It's all photos of the house, Claire on the porch, captions like, 'Thank you, Claire, for keeping the fire alive.' It feels fake, but I didn't dare say anything." Then, almost in a whisper, she asked if I wanted to see it. I swallowed hard and said yes. When the file arrived, I scrolled through the slides. Smiling photos of Claire, words painting her as the savior. At the final slide, bold text glowed. "Thank you, Claire, for preserving our family home." My jaw clenched. I copied the file, made a new version, and began my work. I left the original slides intact, but after Claire's grand finale, I added my own sequence. A timeline of transfers with exact dates, a bar chart of 3 years' worth of payments. Screenshots of my mother's messages, her promises of just this once. Then, the final slide, a photo of the house with words across the bottom. This was my contribution. Do not erase it. When I ran the slideshow, my heart pounded, not with fear, but with clarity. I saved the file on my laptop, on a USB, and in the cloud. I printed the full report, bound and neat, and slipped it into my bag. I was ready. For the first time, I was not planning to ask or to plead. I was planning to reveal. If the truth embarrassed them, that was not my fault. I repeated the line until it steadied my pulse. I imagined the moment the lights dimmed, the relatives applauding Claire, and then the screen shifting to the truth. I would not shout. I would not beg. I would let the evidence speak, and I would let silence fall where it needed to. The days before the dinner, I lived as if on two levels. Outwardly calm, leading meetings at work, smiling with colleagues, inwardly burning, rehearsing the moment when I would walk to the front and plug in my USB, no longer the quiet sister, no longer the shadow. I would be visible at last. The night of the family appreciation dinner arrived draped in golden lights. The restaurant in downtown Seattle glowed like a stage, its tall windows shimmering with reflections of the city. I sat in my car outside for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, listening to the muffled sound of traffic. Through the glass, I could see familiar cars already parked, silhouettes of relatives moving inside. They were gathered not for me, but for Claire, the center of their universe. Yet tonight would not unfold the way they planned. When I finally stepped out of the car, the cool air wrapped around me. My heels clicked on the pavement, each step steady, each echo reminding me of why I was here. I walked into the restaurant and paused by the doorway of the banquet hall. Warm golden light spilled over tables draped in white, glasses clinking as laughter filled the air. My father stood at the head of the room, microphone in hand, his voice strong with pride. My mother sat beside him, eyes shining as if she were witnessing history. And Claire, dressed in emerald satin, smiled with the ease of someone who believed every word spoken in her praise. "We are so fortunate," my father declared, "to have Claire, our daughter, who preserved the family home and ensured that we never lost our place of belonging." Applause rippled through the hall, relatives nodding with admiration, some whispering as they looked at Claire like she was a savior. Not a single word about me, not a single breath about 3 years of sacrifice. I stood by the doorway, my fists curling at my sides, and felt the blood in my veins thrum. The slideshow began. Images of the house in winter, Claire standing proudly on the porch, captions glowing with gratitude. "Thank you, Claire. Our pride, our hope." My throat tightened as each slide erased me further. Then came the moment I had waited for. The final slide appeared, but instead of the glowing tribute, the screen flickered and shifted. A stark white background filled the room, bold black letters spreading across it. Financial contributions, 3 years. The room stilled. Forks clinked back onto plates, conversations cut off mid-sentence. Some gasped. Others turned to look around in confusion. My heart hammered, but my face remained calm. I stepped forward, the sound of my heels echoing through the silence. Every eye turned to me as I walked toward the center of the room. I lifted my chin and spoke clearly, my voice steady enough to carry across the hall. "If the truth embarrasses you, that is not my fault." The screen shifted again. Bars of rising columns filled the space, showing the transfers month after month. Screenshots of desperate messages from my mother followed. "Please, Lily, just this once. Without you, the bank will take the house." Slide after slide, the evidence unfolded. 36 months, $72,000. My name was no longer erased, it was written in numbers too sharp to deny. For a long breath, no one moved. Then, from one corner, someone began to clap. Another joined, then another, until applause rippled through the hall. Relatives turned their eyes toward my parents, some with shock, some with reproach. My father's face drained of color. His hands clutched the microphone as though it might anchor him. My mother's lips trembled, but no words came out. Claire's smile collapsed, her head bowed as her cheeks burned red. I stepped closer to the front, pointing at the screen. 3 years. $72,000. Without that money, the house would have been gone. You know it, and I know it. But you chose silence. You chose to invent another story. Now the family knows the truth. The room filled with whispers. An uncle murmured that he remembered me working endless overtime. An aunt shook her head, saying it was disgraceful to let me carry such a burden while credit went elsewhere. My parents sat frozen under the weight of their relatives' eyes. I let the silence stretch, then lowered my hand. "This is the truth," I said quietly. "This is who kept the house standing. No one can deny it." Applause rose again, louder this time, spreading until it filled the hall. Some relatives stood, clapping with a firmness that felt like support. Claire's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but I didn't look at her again. I hadn't come to soothe or to reconcile. I had come to reveal. The atmosphere shifted sharply. What had begun as a celebration of Claire became something else entirely. A silent tribunal where my parents sat as the judged. I drew in a deep breath, turned, and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I heard my mother's voice, small and trembling. "Lily." But I didn't stop. I shook my head once and answered softly, "The truth is never my fault." I stepped out into the cool night, the air crisp against my skin. The sky above Seattle glittered with stars, the city lights glowing at my feet. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel victory. I felt release. 3 years of weight had lifted, and at last, no one could erase me again. When I returned to my apartment that night, the city outside my windows pulsed with light, but inside it was quiet, almost sacred. I set down my bag and walked barefoot across the polished floor, every step echoing against the stillness. My body trembled, not from fear but from the lingering energy of what I had done. The truth had been spoken. It was no longer buried in my folders or hidden in my spreadsheets. It had been shown, undeniable, before the very people who once erased me. I curled up on my sofa, knees pulled to my chest, and let the silence wash over me. My phone buzzed non-stop on the table, calls from relatives, messages from cousins, even a string of texts from Claire, but I didn't reach for it. For the first time in my life, I was not scrambling to respond, not rushing to justify. I simply let the device buzz itself into silence. The following morning, I rose early and brewed coffee, the aroma filling the air. As I sipped, I finally unlocked my phone. Messages poured in. Some were long, apologetic letters from aunts and uncles who admitted they had never known the truth. Others were short but sincere. "You were brave. We see you now." A few simply sent heart emojis, the kind of quiet support words couldn't carry. And then, there were the messages from my parents. My father wrote only one line, "You embarrassed us." My mother's message was longer, her tone weaving between sorrow and reproach. "Lily, why would you humiliate us like that? Couldn't you have spoken to us privately? We never wanted it to come to this." I read them both slowly, then set my phone down without answering. For years, I had bent myself backward to keep them comfortable. Now, for once, their discomfort was their own to hold. Claire's message was different. It came hours later, a voice note instead of text. I hesitated before pressing play, then listened as her voice cracked with something I hadn't heard before: shame. "Lily, I didn't know," she said softly. "I swear I didn't know the details. I thought they were exaggerating when they praised me, but I didn't ask questions either. I should have. I'm sorry." Her words hung in the air, fragile and raw. For a long moment, I stared at the phone. Part of me wanted to delete the message, to let it dissolve like all the apologies I never received before. But another part of me, tired, aching, simply saved it and moved on. I wasn't ready to forgive, but I no longer needed to fight. The truth was out. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, my life settled into a new rhythm. Work at the startup flourished. My team delivered results that earned recognition across the company, and my name began to circulate in rooms I had never dreamed of entering. I attended conferences, shook hands with leaders in the field, and spoke on panels about financial integrity and resilience. Each time I stood at a podium, microphone in hand, I felt the shadow of my past fall further behind me. Yet in quiet moments at home, I reflected deeply. I thought about the years I had given away, the dreams I had postponed, the self I had almost lost. I realized the greatest betrayal was not the erasure itself, but the way I had allowed it to define me. For too long, I believed I was invisible, when in truth, I had always been the foundation. One Friday evening, instead of driving to my parents' house as I once had, I invited my closest friends to my apartment. We sat around the oak table, laughter spilling louder than any Friday dinner of my past. When I raised my glass for a toast, my voice carried a quiet conviction. "To truth," I said, "and to finally choosing ourselves." Glasses clinked, eyes shone, and in that moment, I knew I had built a new kind of family, one rooted not in obligation, but in choice and love. Later, as the city lights shimmered beyond my windows, I stepped onto the balcony alone. The night air was cool against my skin, the hum of Seattle alive below me. I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness, "I am no longer a shadow." The words floated out, carried by the wind, and I felt them settle deep in my bones. For the first time, I wasn't waiting for acknowledgement from others. I wasn't longing for applause. I was enough, wholly and completely, as I was.